Welcome everyone. It's fantastic that you've been able to join us today. So this is our July DICE talk, and as is now traditional, when it's a quieter time during the academic year, we move online, which is really nice, and that it means that we can talk to people who are a bit further afield, although our guest today isn't terribly far, but we've saved him a train journey. Because it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Humphrey Crick. So Humphrey is a principal specialist in conservation ecology at Natural England. He started his career with a PhD from the University of Aberdeen on weight changes, foraging and the role of helpers in red-throated bee-eaters. And he's published nearly 200 scientific articles and reports since, including some of the earliest work on the impacts of climate change on wild species, with a couple of high-profile papers in Nature in particular. He worked for over a decade for the British Trust for Ornithology before moving to the predecessor of Natural England in 2008. And he's definitely one of those stalwarts of conservation. He's been a member of numerous committees, including being chair of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative and chair of Natural England's Biodiversity Community of Practice. At the moment, he's a member of Biodiversa Plus, the external stakeholder advisory board. And the reason why he's here today is that he recently joined the DICE advisory board. So for people who don't know, we have an advisory board of a set of distinguished and insightful conservation practitioners who meet with us 3 times a year and give us advice and hear what we're doing. So they're an invaluable group. He's a keen bird watcher and bird ringer, a keen photographer, and perhaps slightly less common, he's also a jazz pianist. And in particular, he played for David Attenborough at the opening of the David Attenborough building in Cambridge in 2016. So yes, I know I've known Humphrey for quite a few years now, and have really enjoyed working with him and talking to him over the years, partly because of this sort of his wisdom and his eclectic background. So it's fantastic to have you here today, Humphrey. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Bob. I feel slightly embarrassed by all that, but that's really kind of you. Thank you.
Well, it's
great to be here.
It's all true, so you shouldn't feel embarrassed. Yes, as you know, what we're going to do in this conversation now is just to ask you different questions about your career and the sort of more light-hearted side of conservation as well. And the question I always start off with is, what have you been doing this week?
Well, oh God, what have I been doing this week? What have I been doing this week? It's a good question. I've been doing a whole range of different stuff to do with thinking about various proposals for doctoral training partnerships, various things to do with thinking about spatial conservation planning, actually, as it happens, and also to do with nature networks, how we should be designing nature networks across the country. That's one of my main things that I work on.
Yes, fantastic. And just sort of more broadly, what does your role at Natural England involve?
So I'm in something called the Chief Scientist Directorate, and Natural England has grown enormously just recently. So we're in case people don't know, Natural England is the government advisor on conservation. So we're a non-departmental body, as it's called. So we're an arm's length body. We're not part of DEFRA, but which is the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. But we advise government through the Department of Environment on everything to do with conservation. And we do a whole range of different things, like arranging agri-environment scheme agreements with farmers. We do licensing of things like people who want to go and disturb bats or ring rare birds. We also provide a lot of advice and guidance on planning and so on. But we do quite a bit of research, and we've got about 3,000 people across the country, a lot of them in area teams. And I'm in a more national team, which consists of about 300 scientists. So we've got a really big body of people who work on a whole range of different things, not just ecological things, but also like things like heritage, access to the countryside, and so on. And so my particular area is to work on thinking about, at the moment, is to do with the nature recovery network. So this is one of the government's big plans for the future, is to create a much better countryside for wildlife, so that we'll become, the term is nature positive. So we will have a recovering nature populations, and to think about where we should have protected sites, how can we make the countryside better for them in between those sites, and how do we join up those sites?
Yeah, fantastic. And I mean, how long ago would you say that all the exciting things that are happening now, when did the sort of ideas start bubbling up within Natural England? How long did it take to go from those initial discussions to actually changes in policy?
Yeah, that's taken probably about between 10 and 15 years now. It seems a hideously long time. So there was a brilliant report by Sir John Lawton in 2011 called Making Space for Nature, and he pointed out that we have all these protected sites, but they add up to less than the sum of the parts in a way. And so what he said was we need to have a much better lot of sites, and we need to think about them. And it had a strap line which was bigger, better, more, and join. So they should be bigger sites. We need to make them better. We need more of them, and they should join up. And that has been gradually, that strap line has been really important for conservation. So it wasn't a peer-reviewed paper. It was just a report to government, but people could understand that. Even ministers could understand that, and take it on board and think, yeah, actually, we need to do better. And so it's been gradually seeping through. It's got through to the environmental NGOs, non-governmental organisations, and they've taken it on board. The wildlife trusts, RSPB, and so on. And then we've been working to try and put more definition into that. And some of the work we've done with you, actually, Bob, on thinking about how we should plan out the countryside, and what makes a better site, what makes it, how big should it be, how do we join it up, and how many more do we need, and where they should be. So it's taken that length of time to get to the state where we can, now government has said we want to have this nature recovery network. We've now got to the place where we can tell them how to do it.
Yeah, fantastic. And I know the really important role you've played in all of that, which is as I said, is one of the great reasons to be able to work with you on these sorts of things. So going right back to when you were little, what did you want to be when you grew up? Was it related to any of this?
Well, I always liked animals, it had to be said. So for some reason, I think there must be a strange mutant gene in people who occasionally. So none of my family are particularly interested in wildlife, but I always was.
Okay.
And so I liked animals. I used to get animal magazines, and then I remember. Actually, I think I can almost remember. I think I wrote down the day. Actually, I remember one day I realised that there weren't any decent mammals around which were easy to watch near where I lived. So I better start looking at birds, which I've always been rather dismissive of before then. And so I became a bird watcher at that point, and took some really ghastly pictures of birds, which you can just about make out the dots on them. And then so it went from there. I managed to go and start doing bird ringing, and got into analysing a bit of data at that point even. But my sort of key hero, quite rapidly, was when I read a book called Curious Naturalists by Nico Tinbergen, and that opened up a whole idea of how you could do really interesting experiments in the wild, as it were, which would tell you things about how animals thought and behaved and did things, and that I thought was really exciting. So that's what I wanted to do. I've always wanted to work with birds, actually. So
Yeah.
I've been
So,
really lucky. Unbelievable.
I mean,
In fact,
very,
I'll tell you one other thing.
yeah.
Sorry, I did write to Peter Scott, who people probably don't know, but he was a very famous ornithologist and naturalist of the 1950s, 60s, 70s. He helped create the World Wildlife Fund. World Wildlife Fund for Nature. He also invented the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. And I wrote to him as a child saying, I'd like to become an ornithologist. What do I do? And he very sensibly wrote back saying, I shouldn't do that.
Really?
Yes, he did. He said, I would, keep it as a hobby, and it's really hard to get a job in conservation. So I, of course, ignored that, and I've been really lucky.
Yeah. So I mean, was he right? I mean, I'm guessing in those days there were far fewer jobs in conservation. I mean, it must have been a much smaller niche.
Yeah, I think it definitely was. I think I suppose I was more interested at that time in things like behavioural ecology, and then became more drawn to conservation afterwards. So my PhD was a behavioural ecology sort of PhD.
Yeah.
And then I rapidly realised that it was very difficult to explain to people why I was doing it, and to understand the behaviour of bee eaters in Nigeria. It was quite hard to say to people, what was the value in that. So I then thought, actually, maybe I ought to do something a bit more useful, and then that's got me more into conservation side of things.
Right. And I mean, the fact that you wrote down data as to when you became a birder shows that you were always going to be a good birder. The fact that you made a note of it.
I think that's probably true. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's a sort of another related thing? Have you always been someone who sort of like kept a journal or kept notes, or?
Actually, I'm a really bad diarist. I always start diaries and then they tail off very quickly. So, but when I'm doing bird ringing and things like that, I've learned to record the information. You have to do that, and so I suppose I have recorded it when there's been a need to. But I like all bird watchers, I do keep a list. You have to admit to keeping a bird list. Very bad, I know.
And some people on this Teams call would want to know is how long is your list? How many species have you seen in the UK?
It's not very long. I have to admit to being pretty poor at this. And also, I tend to forget which birds I've seen, so I can see them again as first time, which is quite good.
Yeah, that's a way of increasing joy.
Yeah.
And what was it like doing? So your PhD was on bee eaters in Nigeria.
Yeah.
How long did you spend out in Nigeria for that?
Well, I spent about 2.5 years.
Wow,
it was amazing. Yeah. And NERC paid for me to do it, incredibly.
Yeah.
So I was working with my supervisor. It was Hilary Fry, who was in Aberdeen, and he then carried on. He wrote Birds of Africa. He became the overall editor of Birds of Africa. Great, I think, 8-volume series of things. But he knew everything about bee eaters, and I went out to Nigeria into a game reserve called Yankari Game Reserve in the north.
I guess I've heard of it. Yeah.
But he didn't provide me with any wherewithal to do my research, actually. So I went out there and I started walking about. But then there were things like lions and so on. So that kind of worried me. And I managed to do some slightly dodgy deals whereby I managed to get a Jeep, a Suzuki Jeep, which was much safer. And I spent the time looking at bee eaters. They nest in cliffs. They're very beautiful birds. I don't know if you know bee eaters, but they are absolutely the most beautiful birds. Very nicely coloured. They're not garish. They're just beautiful. And I had the cliffs where they nested, and what I do is dig a big trench around the back of them, and they have nest tunnels going to these cliffs of about 1 metre long. And so you dig a trench around the back, and then you gradually whittle away and find their nest chambers. And I'd stick an old coffee tin onto the back of them. so that I could open them up when I wanted to look at the insides. And then I had electronic weighing perches at the front, where I could weigh the birds as they landed on them, unbeknownst to them. And so I was trying to see what the impact of helpers at the nest, because they had a helping system where more than 2 birds would help rear the young, and see how helpers affected the health of the parents.
Yeah. So you really were in the thick of it in terms of the field work and hands-on, and that's
right. No, yes. So I mean, all sorts of things happened. There were lions, there were elephants and things like that. So I used to have a drive-in hide so I could escape quickly if need be. And one time I came along and found that the bunch of elephants had come through, not only trampled my colony, which was really annoying, but they'd actually eaten my hide. So that was
so they trampled through the
cliff. They'd actually
and on purpose, because the bee-eaters were there, or just for a laugh?
Just it happened to be where they happened to be walking, and I think if you're an elephant, if something gets in the way, that's it really.
Yeah.
And maybe they saw my hide and thought that'd be tasty and ate it because it was made of branches and things.
Right.
And the other things were lions, which I found particularly scary. So I think I still have nightmares about lions, actually.
Wow.
If I'm going to have a nightmare, it'll be a lion chasing me in some way. But I used to be really frightened of lions, and the warden who was there bought me a starting pistol. He said, because he was frightened I was going to leave the reserve, and he actually quite liked me being around. So he bought me a starting pistol, which I could use to frighten off the lion, by making a big bang should it come towards me. And when on the last day, I thought, when I was leaving, I thought I ought to try out this starting pistol. So I went out and found one of the lions, which was hanging around, and I stopped my car nearby and fired the starting pistol, and the lion paid no notice to it whatsoever. So psychological help is often a useful thing.
And in terms of if you weren't doing all of this, sort of if you weren't a conservationist, what do you think you'd be doing?
That's a really difficult question. I really don't know, because I would have done almost anything to become one. I think the only thing I can think about is to have gone into the music business, possibly somehow, shape or form. Yeah. Although I'm not really good enough to be to play professionally, but maybe I could have become like a music impresario or something like that. Somebody who'd organise concerts and things. So I don't know. Who can tell? But I think I wouldn't have given up, and I think that's one of the things if you're really, really keen on it, most people have just not given up despite being knocked back a few times. And
yes, and if you were going to sort of give advice to a student wanting a career in conservation, would that be the main thing to say?
Yeah, and I think also to be lucky. I think, and part of that luck is sort of serendipity in terms of being in the right place at the right time, but actually just being somewhere, even if you haven't got a job, but you just hang around. Sorry, so you probably don't want to hear this, Bob, because I'm encouraging people to hang around your department, but just hang around.
Oh, they're welcome.
Because, if you're there and something comes up, people will want the easiest solution. They say, oh, look, Humphrey, could you help me with this? And that's kind of how I got my postdoc. I was just being very slow writing up. And then one of my colleagues, one of the people who was doing a postdoc left, and there was half a grant left to be completed, and so it was something I could do. So I then got into that, and then that led to the next one, and then eventually so I think be persistent and be lucky, I think, is important.
And those I saw from your CV that those sort of earliest jobs looked at pesticides, or the impacts of pesticides on birds. Is that right, in Scotland and in Zimbabwe?
Yeah. So the first one was literally that. So they were doing are a lot of pine plantations in Scotland of lodgepole pine, which is a American species that doesn't do very well on boggy land in Scotland, and so they were having to. It was getting infested with something called the pine beauty moth, and it could defoliate really large areas quite quickly. Foresters didn't like this, obviously, so they were spraying it from the air with something called phenitrathione, which is an organophosphorus compound. And so the idea was to monitor. We literally put out thousands of nest boxes into these pine plantations. So we had lorries or sort of track vehicles full of nest boxes, which would trundle along the rides and throwing out nest boxes, and then you'd have we got a group of people to follow along, picking them up and nailing them onto trees. So we put out literally thousands of nest boxes, and then monitored the breeding success of the birds after spraying, or during and before and after spraying, as well as having some with camera nest boxes on, which took pictures of the birds every time they came into the nest. And so that was great. Really enjoyed that. I have an embarrassing fondness for pine plantations and Sitka spruce, which other conservationists rather frown on. But they're quite.
How come? I mean, isn't it just rows and rows of the same species?
They are, but actually they do have quite a lot of birds in them, okay. Especially at the sort of thicket stage when they're not too big. And actually, up in north of Scotland, we came across a small number of redwings, which are very rare, rare nesting birds in Britain, which were nesting in Sitka spruce. Yeah. In fact, I tried to write a short paper on this, but it got bounced because the referee said, we don't want people liking Sitka spruce, so I'm not going to accept this paper, which I thought was very unfair.
Yes, and so science marches onwards, yes.
That's right. Yeah, and then I got out that led on to working with the Overseas Development Department to look at the side effects of spraying in Zimbabwe, where they were still doing a lot of DDT spraying.
Right, okay.
Against tsetse fly, which is a transmitter of sleeping sickness, which is a horrible disease of people and of cattle. So they'd send large numbers of people out, literally, and throughout the whole landscape, spraying DDT underneath every log, stone in the landscape, because tsetse flies don't like it too hot, and when it gets too hot, they go and seek shelter and shade underneath rocks and stones. So if you spray it with DDT, they then get the DDT and die. So it was a lot of DDT.
Yeah, because that's what I was going to ask. I mean, how have things changed? I mean, I know that there's a lot less spraying of DDT now, although I think in some places they still use it for mosquito control, don't they, around people's underneath people's roofs. But the spraying in Scotland, are similar things still happening, or
I think
they've changed?
They've moved over. I don't think there's so much lodgepole pine now, and I think they learned to spray with. They moved over to pyrethroids. And that's what they did in Zimbabwe as well, because the thought was that DDT in a tropical country would degrade much faster and wouldn't cause the same sorts of problems as it does in Europe and North America. But actually it was getting into the eggshells of things like river eagles and causing eggshell thinning. So it was in the environment and causing the same effect. And so they moved over to deltamethrin, which kills a lot of insects, but doesn't do things up the food chain.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So I'm now going to sort of come on to some slightly more flippant questions related to conservation. One of which is which conservationist do you think should be on TV more? Who's missing from our screens?
Well, that's quite difficult. I actually think I was going to say Natural England staff, actually, my colleagues, because they are brilliant. There are lots of them. I joined Natural England. I had no idea what really it was like, And I found that it's just full of people who are incredibly knowledgeable, really know their patch, know their areas or know their topics, and they're really good at explaining things. So I think we just need to get more of them on television.
Yeah, I mean, is there, like, do any of them use social media? I mean, is that the sort of thing that would be encouraged in terms of having a a platform where they can share their wisdom?
Yeah, I think some of them might do blogs. Some of them are on Twitter, and I think, yeah, and we're kind of allowed to be on Twitter, but we mustn't say anything too political,
Right?
Which might, yeah, because we are a government agency.
Yeah,
after, yeah,
yes, of course.
at the end of it, yeah.
And which book that's not about conservation do you think every conservationist should read?
Well, actually, yeah, I mentioned it earlier. Is this one, Curious Naturalists by Nico Tinbergen, and just because conservationists, I don't think a lot of conservationists don't think in an experimental way, and an awful lot of what they're doing actually could so easily be experimental and then provide evidence which could be used to help improve conservation practice. An awful lot of it is in their head, and they do things like they do an intervention and say, oh, that works, and then just carry on doing it. But it's they didn't include a control. If they'd included a control, they could then write it up, publish it on something like conservationevidence.com, and the world would be a better place. But so much of it isn't. So I think if everybody read Curious Naturalists, they'd see, whoa, there's some really interesting little neat experiments. You don't have to be super, amazing. You can work these out, and you could design them and make conservation better.
Yeah, fantastic.
But it's an animal behavior book, so it's not a conservation one. That's my theory.
Yes, yeah, no, definitely that counts as wider reading.
Yeah.
And once they make you world president, which conservation law would you bring in first?
Well, it's got to be stopping rainforest deforestation, I'm afraid. Yeah, and also we're a rapid move to net zero, so that would be it. Yeah, because we got to. That's the biggest thing that's going to affect everybody.
Yeah. So this is maybe a silly question, but I'm intrigued what your answer will be. Is the way you approach conservation influenced in any way by being a jazz musician?
Well, I like to improvise. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it probably too does go hand in hand a little bit. I like to draw in stuff from a whole range of different subjects. So I read quite a lot and quite widely in different topics, and I think quite a lot of the best people in ecology and conservation have often come from different disciplines and so on. And I think if you can bring in ideas, which you do in jazz as well, you listen to other people, you bring them into the way you play. Yeah, so I think eclectic listening all round is probably, and using it.
Brilliant. Yes, I'm glad I asked the question now. It wasn't a silly question, so I'm pleased. And also a sort of similar thing. So you sort of started your career with this very strong species focus, and sort of over time have started doing a lot more on landscapes and that sort of higher scale.
Yeah.
Do you see any difference in that? And do you see sort of how people who mostly do species or mostly do landscapes, can you see that they look at the world in different ways?
I think they do a bit, yeah. So I moved over from the BTO to Natural England because I kind of felt that there was thinking about birds all the time is brilliant, but just a little bit too narrow for me. And I'd got more and more into climate change thinking, and we'd done some work which was looking at a wider range of species. So we'd done some work with, bringing in people who worked on cephalopods and cetaceans and, all bats and all this sort of stuff. So I was kind of pleased to then move over and think about more general issues to do with habitats. And I mean, people who work on species do think about the habitat they work on, that the species live in, but it's kind of a bit narrow, and a more systems type of thinking, which thinking about ecosystems forces you to do, is kind of, in a way, to me, more interesting and like to provide more beneficial results in the end for more species than just concentrating on one species.
And as you said, you know, you worked for BTO for over a decade before moving to Natural England.
Actually, it was 20 years.
Was it 20 years? Okay, shows I can't count when I'm going through your CV.
19 years and 11 months, actually.
Okay. And sort of, what would you say the difference is between working for an NGO, and I know sort of BTO is a slightly unusual NGO, but sort of working for that type of organisation, you know, rather than government? And are there sort of traits or characteristics of people that mean that they'd be better suited to one or the other? You know, if you're talking to someone who's sort of early on in their career, what things would make you recommend going down the NGO or the government route?
Yeah, so actually the people involved are very, very similar, I think. And I've always, maybe I've been very lucky, but I've always found people involved in conservation to be really nice people. I've really enjoyed working with them. And the BTO was nice because it had about 90 people in it, and you knew every one of them, and you were kind of, you could talk to any of them, and it was very friendly. It did feel like a family. It was really nice. And what that allows you to do is to work on very specific projects. Whereas when you move over to when I moved over to Natural England, and I don't know how true it is of the other agencies like Environment Agency or Forestry Commission, for example, Forest Research, there's a whole range of other things that come in. So there are like urgent requirements that come in from government saying we want to have an answer to this really quickly, and you can get involved in sort of legal issues a bit more. So both policy and legal, and less to do with I guess the science of things, particularly as a scientist anyway. And you have to be able to translate your science into something which is relevant to policy. So I'm not sure I'm answering that very well, but it is quite different. It took me ages to learn how Natural England worked because it's so huge, and it has labyrinthine processes at times. But the advantage of it is that you can actually have a real effect. You can almost see the line from what you're talking about to sometimes affecting what happens, you know, what government does and what happens on the ground. So in that case, it's really nice. Whereas if you're working for an NGO, your influence is much more limited in a way.
And you mentioned sort of sometimes you have these issues that you're asked to come up with a sort of a rapid response to. Is there one of those recently that you could talk about to sort of illustrate the types of things? So I haven't been involved in this one. No, I'm just wondering about this. Is what you're allowed to talk about.
Yeah, that's right. You know, so for example, there's been all hands on deck for recently because pheasant shoots have to have there isn't a general license now for pheasant shoots near a triple SI, a site of special scientific interest. So if you want to have a pheasant shoot and release pheasants near them, you have to have a specific license. So because that changed suddenly, there was suddenly a lot of pheasant shoots that wanted a license. So an awful lot of people had to just stop what they were doing and go and help create those sort of licenses. So that's one example. And then there's another thing that I haven't been involved in that, but I know quite a lot of people have been. And another thing was a case where I went and helped it was a case over on the Broads actually, where the landowners were particularly keen to stop the abstraction of water, which they would say was affecting their nice bit of fen, which was a triple SI. And so they were upset at, I guess, government allowing the abstraction of water. So they were the area team there needed some help to provide them with information, evidence information. So I came in, although I didn't know very much about it, came in and then looked at the evidence and looked at what was being said, and was able to provide a sort of considered objective view, which then helped the whole situation to be discussed in better way, and ultimately with quite a good result, I think.
And what sort of evidence are you looking at for that?
So in that case, I was looking at a lot of different papers. Actually, I had to go and review papers and look at in this case, it was abstraction of water leading to an increased salinity of the Broad that was concerned. So as you took more water out, the salty water could come up a little bit higher and then affect the plant life. And so I was looking at the impact of different levels of salinity on the plant life, as well as understanding how far salinity was increasing as well. So it was slightly quite outside my comfort zone, but it was really interesting to get into. And so yeah, that's the kind of unexpected thing I've been asked to do, and the sort of thing you might end up doing when you come to somewhere like Natural England. Yeah.
And is there anything that if you could say to people writing scientific articles to make your life easier? What are the types of paper that you read and go, that's really helpful, and what are the ones that you go, that was a waste of time?
Yeah, I really like the new style of abstracts which are provided, which have, like, instead of just a paragraph which you have to wade through, but actually it has sort of it divides stuff into methods, results, and just conclusion and so on. I think that those sorts of papers are really, really helpful. And I guess at the end of a paper, having a small section which says what are the implications in a practical sense, potentially for conservation, but generally in practical sense, would be really, really helpful.
And when you're a sort of a co-author on papers, what roles do you think you bring with your Natural England hat on with those? Is there anything specific?
Well, I'm able. I think working. So academics often don't really understand the policy framework, and so I'm able to help with that. So, for example, the 25-year environment plan, and now the environment improvement plan as well, and be able to put the importance of the word in the context of how it could influence policy, and also then do the same in both in the introduction and discussion parts of this. Apart from, I always like to, I like looking at stuff and seeing if it makes sense, and working out how could I. I'm very critical, actually. Although I hope to be a critical friend, but I like to. I'm always questioning. You have to be questioning, don't you?
Yeah. And in terms of sort of academics not knowing that policy context, is it something that we could do more, or is it something that it makes more sense just to work with people like you?
I know. I think it really would be good to do more. I don't know. Yeah, to do as much as possible in terms of helping people understand the wider sort of policy framework. So things like the global biodiversity framework's just been published, for example, and how it all works with Convention of Biodiversity, the UN United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, all those sorts of things, to understand how all those provide an overarching framework for then what everybody does at the country level, and then also to understand what's happening at the country level too, would be really helpful, I think. So I read we were asked to support a grant proposal for actually a CDT, and it was just terrible. It was the most awful project. I won't say who or where it came from, but the person was an academic who really didn't understand how good the scientists were in somewhere like Natural England, how good the science was, and also the policy was. So the idea was just to create a model which would predict the environment into the future, and there was no hint of talking about scenarios or understanding that there's social science aspects that need to be brought in as well. It was just a sort of mechanistic ecological project, and it just, we're way past that. and I think that's because the person was actually more of an evolutionary ecologist who really didn't have a clue about it. So I think the more, places like DICE, I think, is good at this. So the more you can able to get students to understand this sort of framework, the better.
Yeah. Yes. Brilliant. Well, after that slight compliment, I will move on to a different section about in the field questions. And the first one is, what's your favourite place for wildlife?
My favourite place for wildlife? Well, there are two places actually. In Britain, it's got to be Brownsea Island, actually, in Poole Harbour, middle of Poole Harbour. It's a brilliant place. If people haven't been there, it's Poole Harbour is one of the. I think it's the second largest natural harbour in the world after Sydney Harbour. It's mainly very, very shallow, and in the middle of it is an island called Brownsea Island, which is quite big. It's been owned by a succession of weird people who have changed it over time, and as a result, it's got this incredible mosaic of different habitats, which make it really interesting. And it's got red squirrels on it, which is unusual down in the south. And it's got. I did a lot of my proto bird watching there, so that's why I love that. Okay. Love that area. And then my other area would have to be Yankari Game Reserve. Actually, I was thinking about this. Okay. I was thinking, well, should I go for Ngorongoro Crater? Yeah, that's amazing. But I would love to go back there, but I think it's too dangerous because it's Boko Haram and things like that around in that area.
Yes, I was talking to someone from there who was interested in doing a PhD at DICE, and the sort of Foreign Office advice meant that it would have been complicated. So I think there are people doing amazing work there, but it's still certainly if you want to get permission from a UK university to have a PhD there, it's a bit complicated.
I bet it is. Yeah.
And which country would you like to visit for the first time to see their wildlife?
So I'd like to go to India, actually. I've never been to India, and I'd love to, because they've got incredible, like Bharatpur has got these amazing wetlands with huge numbers of wildfowl and things, but I'd like to also go and see like Indian rhinos and tigers. Yeah,
me too. It's on my list.
Okay, we'll have to go together.
Well, no, okay, there's a plan.
We'll do a joint trip. Spatial planning in India.
Well, I mean, you know me, I can apply what I know anywhere, especially if I get to see one-horned rhinos. And at the other end of the scale, where's the worst place that you've stayed the night when you've been doing field work?
I think probably the worst place has been on the floor of a police station in Zimbabwe, which was because we'd managed to crash our vehicle, which was a beautiful Land Rover, and we'd accidentally gone over the edge of a cliff. And that
would do it.
That would do it. I remember seeing the trees. It wasn't a complete cliff. It was a very steep slope, and I remember seeing these saplings on it, which were going like as we were smashing through them, and eventually we came to rest against a very big tree. So the Land Rover was somewhat out of action at that point, we got rescued by some Zimbabwean army who were a little bit intimidating and frightening. And then the tsetse fly people managed to radio for help, and they sent a lorry out. So we were rescued from the army quite quickly. But then the police wanted to see if, thinking about whether we'd been driving without due care and attention. And so we had to spend the night on the floor in a police station. All we had was one of those survival blanket, sort of tin foil thing to keep us warm. Yeah, so that wasn't very pleasant.
No, I could imagine. Whereabouts in Zimbabwe?
This was in it was on the way. It was halfway down Kariba, Lake Kariba.
Oh, okay. Oh, blimey, yeah. So properly middle of nowhere.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah.
And what's the largest wild animal that got into your accommodation, and how did you remove it? I'm hoping it's not a lion, and that's why you have nightmares.
No, it isn't a lion, thank God. No, no. The largest one is actually. I was sitting there. This was when I was doing my PhD in Nigeria. I was sitting in my sort of tin hut, reading in the morning or having my breakfast or something, and then the door opened and this ginormous male baboon came in. And I don't know, baboons have these enormous fangs. I mean, they're really, really big. Anyway, he looked at me. I went, whoa, like this to try and scare it off. And it just looked at me with complete contempt. And it just sauntered in, saw a loaf of bread on my table, picked it up, gave one sort of backward glance at me as a sort of sneer curling on his lips, and then wandered out. But that was, potentially quite a dangerous situation.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was lucky he knew how to open the door on the way out. Yeah.
And what's the rarest species that you've seen?
Oh, the rarest ones were in New Zealand, actually. I was lucky enough to go to New Zealand for one of the ornithological congresses out there. And we got a trip to one of these amazing islands where they've been, putting small populations of really rare species, because if they keep them on the mainland, they'll get eaten by something. And so it's something called the stitch bird, of which there are only about 20 or 30 alive at the time. So I felt very lucky to see one of them.
Yeah, amazing. And which extinct species would you like to bring back?
It's got to be a dodo. I just love dodos. I think I want to see what dodos do, put them back on Mauritius, and because even the mock-ups, they don't look real. I want to know what they really look like. So, I know we're not meant to like the idea of recreating species like Jurassic Park, but I think, just at least a couple of dodos would be good.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem quite gloomy, doesn't it? The idea that, that if we bring dodos back, people might not realise that the extinction crisis is an important thing. I mean, I would, with the whole sort of wilding, rewilding, there's sort of it. Yeah. Which species would you like brought back to the UK? Do you have a favourite?
Oh, yeah. Well, I suppose we're not allowed to recreate aurochs, are we?
No. Well,
Actually, do you know what? So I love the idea of bison, which you've got in Kent already. Yes. I think moose would be pretty good. I'd like to bring it. Yeah. Do you fancy some moose?
Well,
I think that'd be quite good in the wetland areas.
Yeah, and I mean, there's sort of long-term discussions about it around here.
Are there?
Yeah, right. But the issue is that they, the bison turn out to be, not a threat at all, whereas moose would be a lot more dangerous.
Would they? Oh, yeah. Right. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but I'd still be up for it.
Yeah, I was thinking moose in the fens would be quite good.
Moose in the fens would be amazing. Yeah.
And of course, we've got to have lynx.
Yeah.
This is me not as a natural young person, probably. Or maybe I am. I'm not sure. I'm sure Tony Juniper would like lynx, but I think lynx would be brilliant, and it would help get rid of all these blooming muntjac around.
Yeah.
As well, which come and eat my tulips.
So yes, proper human-wildlife conflict.
That's right. Yes.
And which species do you think is the most overrated?
I'm going to be a bit controversial here, possibly, which is the honeybee.
Ah, yeah.
Because they're basically, everybody loves honeybees. And okay, we do like honey. And they do a lot of pollination, but there's an awful lot of other things that could do the pollination probably better than honeybees. And so they're kind of I view them as livestock. I'm going to get into a lot of trouble over this, aren't I?
Well, I mean, possibly, but it's it's backed up by the science.
Yeah. So they're I think honeybees probably. I think they're overrated. I'd rather have lots more solitary bees and bumblebees.
Yeah, I mean, do you encounter sort of anything similar with the sort of talking to stakeholders or politicians or people who don't necessarily have the expertise? Are there sort of similar issues that you encounter?
Oh, I think well in terms of honeybees, or
well, just in terms of, as you say, there's the sort of popular idea that honeybees are incredibly important and incredibly special.
Yeah. No, I think that's it's incredibly widespread. I think if you asked almost anybody, they'd say, "Oh, honeybees, yeah, they're great, they're really important things. We've got to save the honeybee." In fact, I went to a play in Cambridge recently, which was called the Beekeeper of Aleppo. And at the end of it, they had a collection for supporting beekeepers, which is sort of understandable. But I'd preferred them to have a lecture, collection in support of wild pollinator populations. But people like honeybees, so I think it's really widespread. And they kind of think. I think most people think honeybees are kind of wild animals.
Yeah. And on a slightly related note, what's your favourite tree to make sure that we are balancing the animals with some plants?
Well, this is embarrassing because having said I don't like honeybees, I like apple trees. Their blossom is brilliant. And actually, I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment called The Orchard, or called Orchard, by it's Benedict MacDonald and Nick Gates, and it's all about this incredible orchard that they've come across in the West Country, which has never had any inputs at all. It's got loads of gnarled old apple trees of incredibly ancient types. And it's like this oasis, apparently, in a landscape of gloom, which most of the countryside is, where they've got lots of lesser spotted woodpeckers. They got nightingales. They got all sorts of things living in there. What's it called? The cockchafer beetles, isn't it? Those sorts of things.
Yeah.
These lots of things that like eating dead wood and so on. And it's an incredible oasis of sort of abundance of wildlife. So yeah, I like apple trees, and I think and in the book they say that actually orchards and apple trees were really common in the past and were very much a sort of part of the landscape. So we ought to treasure them.
Yeah, fantastic.
So there we go.
Yeah, and so just sort of coming to the end and winding up, and it's been lovely hearing your sort of positivity and optimism about a whole set of things. I mean, what aspect of English conservation would you say you're most optimistic about? What's the thing that really inspires you at the moment?
Well, yeah. Normally, having worked on climate change for a lot of time, I usually like to revel in doom and gloom, but at the moment, I think it's never been better to be a conservationist right now in this country. It really hasn't. So we've got a government. So Michael Gove set it off. A government which has got this great plan for nature with the 25-year environment plan, the environment improvement plan, and so on, to and they've said they want to leave the environment in a better place than they found it. They're talking about turning around bending the curve of population declines, So we're going to be planting 500,000 hectares, creating 500,000 hectares of new types of habitat. There's some great northern forest being done. There are the leaving. Okay, the one good thing about Brexit was the fact that we got out of CAP, and so the Environment Land Management Scheme, if it's created well, should be really good for the environment. And so there are things like landscape recovery projects, which are going to be big landscape things to encourage farmers to do good stuff for the countryside. So I think that there's a huge amount of positivity now in terms of we really can make a difference. So conservationists coming in now can have fantastic impact, and it'd be great. I think we could potentially have a much better world in the next 20 years than we've had over the past 30 years.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you so much, Humphrey. That was really nice to hear more about your career and all the cool stuff that you've done in the past, and finishing on that note of optimism is the perfect end. So thank you very much for joining me today.
It's been lovely chatting. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolute pleasure. And so the Dice Talk next month will actually be in person, and we'll have some of the master students presenting some of the work that they've done. So for those of you listening who are in Canterbury, for those of you who are listening who are master's students, get ready to talk about your work, and it will be lovely to see you in person. But for the meantime, thank you again, Humphrey. That was really great.